Let's say right now we accepted the resurrection as possible. Would that resurrection contradict any other known historical information?
Well, so if we accepted that a resurrection really happened in the first century, um, I really don't know if we would have any kind of different evidence. I would think that we would have more like firsthand account kind of evidence. We would have Paul indicating that, these people, really knew Jesus in real life, and then also saw them rise. But I mean, even now in Paul's writings, you have him in 1 Corinthians 15:3-8. He talks about several people that supposedly saw Jesus Christ rise from the dead. So, I mean, if he really did rise from the dead, and resurrect, as we understand it from the Bible, I really don't think that there's anything else that we would find, like actual resurrection versus no resurrection. I think that we would still have the exact same kind of evidence that we have now.
Okay. Have you ever, or let me backtrack for a second. How do you feel, or what is your thought on presuppositional apologetics?
I feel like presuppositional apologetics is kind of a lazy way to argue for a position. Because, I mean, you're basically just starting off the argument like, well, I presuppose that God exists, so therefore you're wrong. Right. And then you automatically win the debate, according to you. So it's kind of a really poor way to argue for a belief, I would think.
Would you ever debate a presuppositionalist or anyone for that matter?
Oh yeah, definitely. I mean, I've debated plenty of people before. I can't remember if I've directly debated a presuppositionalist, but I've dealt with a lot of their arguments, and it really just basically boils down to they presuppose that God exists, and and because God exists, God wrote the Bible, and so they have this whole logic chain that they run through in order to get back around to the idea that, well, that means that God exists. But it's a circular argument, because you're just saying, well, I presuppose God exists, so that means that God exists.
So then follow up to that, because when I had debated a presuppositionalist, he said, well, science is a circular argument because you're using science to prove science. How would you address that?
Well, I'd have to ask, like, how is science used to prove science? Because at that point, I really don't know what he even means by science. Like, I mean, are you using the scientific method to verify the scientific method?
I would think that's what he was trying to get at, if I'm remembering correctly.
I would love see. This is where I think people need to be a little bit more direct in asking for examples, because I would really have to have like an example of like how somebody would use the scientific method in order to validate the scientific method, because the scientific method was developed out of the philosophy of science, and that's like the how we can come to know this reality. And I mean, like, that's more of a philosophy of science kind of question as to whether or not the scientific method can give you accurate results. You wouldn't actually use the scientific method to validate the scientific method.
Okay. So how do you feel where you're at now versus when you started? So, for example, several people have said to me, as time goes on, you're not going to be as friendly, you're going to get more tainted. How has your perspective changed with time in doing this?
Oh, well, I mean, I feel like I'm very much more connected on a social level, like, to other people in the community. Maybe that's just because I have I've always kind of increased my social media following. But I mean, I feel like I have a lot more friends now than I ever did. And I don't really have to pretend with these friends, because like I would have to pretend to, be into like God and Jesus when, I mean, I believed in God and Jesus, but I really wasn't like hardcore kind of Christian, you know?
Right.
So I mean, I would have to, go to youth services just so that I could have fun with my friends and everything. So, I mean, I really don't have to do that now. I mean, mainly because, I don't really have any local friends, but I do have a lot of like close online friends, and we get together and we hang out, and I don't feel the need to like pretend or be a different person or censor myself. So it's a lot, that's a lot better in my opinion. But as far as my core person, I mean, I really don't think that I've changed, other than I've stopped beating myself up over things that I once considered to be sinful, but now I really don't find them to be all that bad. They're either neutral or, they're in some cases good. It's really helped me identify the nuances in like the moral conversation.
Right.
The nuances in like murder and things of that nature. Not that I think about murder a lot or anything. I'm just saying in the conversation of morality, like the nuances to murder are kind of vast as to what you mean and whether or not it's right or wrong, and then comparing how we understand murder now to how God commands the Israelites to kill people for literally no reason sometimes. So I mean, I think that it's really helped me develop personally a good bit.
But so I want to say something I've heard just in response to what you're saying. But what stops you from murdering people if you don't believe in God? I'm sorry. I'm assuming you've heard that before.
Yeah. Well, I mean, first off, I'd have to say that if you feel like you need to believe in God to keep yourself from murdering somebody, maybe you need to see a psychiatrist or something. Because I mean, see, here's the thing: is that pretty much everybody, at least that we're going to interact with, live in pretty much the same kind of society. And all successful societies seem to have the same basic sets of moral values or moral facts. And one of those would be don't kill your neighbor or don't kill your fellow person in your society. That's pretty much well defined in all societies. And I think that it's gotten to the point now where there's not really any kind of confusion on whether or not that's wrong. For I guess normal people, and then you have people that lack. I say normal, but for most of the population. Then you got the smaller portions of the population that are sociopathic or psychopathic, and I just that particular area really highlights to me that it doesn't matter whether or not you believe in God or not. If you're able to kill somebody, you don't find anything wrong with killing another person, you're going to do that regardless of whether or not you believe in God. So I really am confused whenever somebody tells me you have to believe in God to not murder, or to know that you shouldn't murder somebody, when you have plenty of religious people out there that have murdered in the present and in the past, and I'm sure in the future.
So how else, obviously aside from becoming the Godless engineer on YouTube, how else has becoming an atheist influenced your day-to-day life and mindset?
It really hasn't affected me too much, other than I always try to better myself. And when I was a Christian, I would just believe things that people I trusted told me, right? And so after becoming an atheist, I guess as a result of my investigation of my beliefs, I'm more able to actually critically think about whether or not I believe something. I think that's been the biggest change, but I mean, that still hasn't changed like my core person. How I view morality may have changed a little bit with a new look on life. But I think that's only changed for the better, because things that, like I said, things that I thought were sins at one time, now to me are not sinful. Like, they're not bad.
Right.
They're either neutral or good. And so, that actually helped me out a lot, because like growing up in the South, I've had a lot of run-ins with like racism.
Oh,
And yeah, and it's always been a struggle, because like I'm sitting here thinking that I'm the one that's like wrong or off, when I don't have a problem with seeing two guys holding hands walking down the street, or I don't see a problem with an interracial couple.
Same.
And like I'm sitting here thinking that like, well, I know that everybody else thinks that's wrong or bad, but I don't understand why it's wrong or bad. I just know everybody else thinks that it is, and so it's just it's kind of odd. Thinking about that though, this one time I was in middle school, and I had this kid that was sitting next to me that was harassing me, right? And I can't remember what I said to him, but I said, like, one day I finally snapped and I said something back to him. And then when I got called to the principal's office, and when I got in there, the principal was like, "How about I make y'all hold hands and go back to class?" Because it was something to do with homosexuality,
Right.
And I get the point that the guy was trying to make, even though I think that was a bit inappropriate. I think now, like knowing how I feel now about things, and not really caring about what other people think about me, I think that at that point in time, I would have been like, that's fine. I'll hold his hand going back to class. I don't care.
Right. It's
Like,
not a big deal.
right, exactly. But at the time, I would be teased for possibly being homosexual, and so like it was kind of which is kind of a weird thing, because I mean, normally you think about LGBTQ kids getting teased for it, but this is like I mean, I was a cis white guy, and I was being teased for like sort of like being a fantasy. I guess that like they had a fantasy about me being a homosexual or something. Like they were using homosexuality like against me as like a pejorative,
Right.
and at the time I was like, well, I don't want that to happen. But now, I mean, just in comparison, now there's a video on my channel. I can't remember. It was one of my comments video, but I actually went to a sex shop and got a dick lollipop,
Okay.
and I sucked it on camera. And so I just thinking about the differences between like me as a kid and me now. I mean, there are some stark differences.